Some secrets are not buried by people. Sometimes, they are hidden by time itself. The storm arrived just after midnight, rolling across the Montana mountains like a dark ocean of wind and rain. For hours, thunder echoed through the valleys while towering pine trees bent beneath powerful gusts. By sunrise, the worst had passed. The sky remained gray, but the air felt strangely still. Caleb Walker stepped onto the porch of his small cabin and surveyed the damage. Branches littered the property. Sections of fencing had collapsed. Several trees leaned at awkward angles along the edge of the forest. Beside him stood Ranger, a 10-year-old German shepherd whose black and tan coat glistened with moisture from the wet morning grass. The old dog sniffed the air carefully. His amber eyes scanned the tree line as though searching for something invisible. Caleb grabbed his work gloves and headed toward the damaged section of land beyond the cabin. Ranger followed close behind. They spent most of the morning clearing fallen limbs and inspecting the property. The scent of fresh pine filled the air. Mud clung to their boots as they crossed the soaked ground. Several times Caleb paused to admire the resilience of the mountains around him. Storms came and went. The wilderness always endured. Near noon, they reached the northern edge of the property where an enormous pine tree had stood for decades. Caleb stopped abruptly. The giant tree was gone. Its massive root system now protruded from the earth like the ribs of some ancient creature. The trunk stretched nearly 80 feet across a clearing, crushing bushes and smaller saplings beneath its weight. Caleb shook his head slowly. "I figured you would outlast all of us," he murmured. He remembered seeing the tree when he first moved there 20 years earlier. It had already been old then. Ranger walked ahead without hesitation. The German shepherd approached the exposed roots and began sniffing. At first, Caleb paid little attention. Dogs investigated everything. It was what they did. But after several minutes, Ranger remained fixed on the same spot beneath the tangled roots. Then he did something unusual. He began licking the soil. Caleb frowned. "What are you doing?" Ranger ignored him. The dog licked the dirt again. Then again. Not randomly. Always the exact same location beneath the largest section of roots. Caleb stepped closer. The soil there appeared darker than the surrounding ground. Rainwater had washed away part of the earth during the storm, exposing patches of clay and stone beneath. Ranger continued licking the area with quiet determination. When Caleb called him away, the German shepherd refused to move. That alone was enough to capture his attention. Ranger had spent years working beside him. The dog was disciplined, intelligent, and exceptionally obedient. If he ignored a command, there was usually a reason. Caleb crouched beside him. "What did you find?" Ranger paused briefly and looked up. Their eyes met for a second. Then the dog immediately returned to the same patch of exposed soil and licked it once more. Wind moved gently through the clearing. Water dripped from broken branches overhead. Caleb examined the ground more carefully. Nothing obvious appeared unusual. No animal burrow. No exposed roots carrying a strange scent. Nothing. Yet Ranger refused to leave. Minutes passed. Then nearly an hour. The German shepherd remained there the entire time. Watching. Sniffing. Licking the same small section beneath the uprooted tree. And as the afternoon light filtered through the clouds above, Caleb began to realize that whatever had captured Ranger's attention might have been waiting beneath that tree for far longer than either of them could imagine. The afternoon grew colder as clouds drifted slowly across the Montana sky. Most people would have forgotten about the fallen tree and continued with their day. Caleb tried. He truly did. Yet every time he walked away, Ranger remained behind. The German shepherd sat beneath the exposed roots as though standing guard over something only he could sense. By 3 o'clock, Caleb had finished repairing part of the damaged fence line and clearing debris near the cabin. When he looked toward the northern clearing again, Ranger was still there. Unmoving. Waiting. A cold breeze carried the scent of wet pine and fresh earth across the property. Caleb sighed and grabbed a shovel from the shed. "All right, old boy," he said. "Let us see what is so important." Ranger immediately rose to his feet. The dog followed him back to the uprooted tree with renewed energy. As they approached, Caleb noticed something he had overlooked earlier. Rainwater from the storm had washed away a narrow section of soil beneath the roots. The exposed ground revealed a faint outline that did not appear natural. At first it looked like a flat stone. Then Caleb noticed the shape was too regular, too straight. Ranger walked directly to the same location and began licking the earth once more. Not the roots. Not the surrounding mud. The exact same spot. Caleb knelt beside him and pushed away loose dirt with his gloved hand. The soil felt unusually compact beneath the surface, almost as if it had been disturbed years ago and then carefully covered again. He paused. A strange feeling settled into his chest. The forest around them had grown quiet. Even the wind seemed softer now. Ranger lowered his nose and sniffed deeply. Then he sat beside the spot and looked at Caleb. The gesture felt familiar. During his years in the Marine Corps, Caleb had worked alongside military dogs on several occasions. This was how trained dogs indicated a discovery, not by barking, not by digging wildly, by sitting beside the source. Calm, certain, Caleb pressed the shovel into the wet ground. The blade sank easily through the softened soil. He lifted one section, then another. Dark earth piled beside the roots. Ranger watched every movement. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The hole gradually deepened. Nothing appeared. Caleb was beginning to wonder if he had imagined the entire thing when the shovel struck something hard. A sharp metallic sound echoed through the clearing. He froze instantly. Ranger stood. His ears lifted. The dog took a single step forward. Caleb carefully cleared away more dirt. The object remained hidden beneath several inches of mud, but its surface reflected a faint glimmer beneath the afternoon light. Metal. Old metal. His pulse quickened. Another few minutes of digging revealed part of a rusted corner. Then a flat edge. Whatever lay beneath the tree had not arrived there naturally. Someone had placed it there. Deliberately. Years ago. Caleb sat back on his heels and stared at the partially exposed object. Questions flooded his mind. Who buried it? Why choose this location? Why beneath a tree that had stood untouched for decades? Ranger moved closer and gently touched the mud-covered metal with his nose. Then he looked at Caleb. The old German shepherd's amber eyes seemed almost relieved, as though he had finally reached the destination he had been trying to show him all day. The sun dipped lower behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the clearing. Caleb brushed away another layer of dirt and revealed what appeared to be the corner of a small metal box. Rust covered most of its surface. Time had nearly erased it from existence. Yet somehow it had survived, hidden beneath roots, hidden beneath years of silence, hidden until a storm and a loyal German shepherd brought it back into the light. The forest darkened as evening approached. Long shadows stretched across the clearing where the fallen pine rested like a giant sleeping beneath the fading sky. Caleb wiped mud from his gloves and knelt beside the partially exposed object. Ranger remained close, standing quietly at his shoulder. The German shepherd no longer licked the ground. His job, it seemed, had changed. Now he simply watched, waiting, guarding. Caleb carefully cleared away the remaining soil around the metal box. Years of moisture had covered it with rust, but its shape remained intact. It was rectangular, roughly 18 inches long and perhaps 10 inches wide. Not large, yet heavy enough that Caleb needed both hands to lift it from the earth. Mud fell from its sides as he carried it onto a flat section of exposed roots. The box had no markings, no labels, no obvious clues. Only time itself had left a signature across its weathered surface. A small corroded latch held the lid shut. Caleb studied it for a moment. Whoever buried this had wanted it protected, hidden, forgotten. He glanced toward Ranger. "Well, partner," he said softly. "We have come this far." The dog sat beside him, calm as ever. The latch resisted at first. Rust had fused parts of the metal together over the years. Caleb used the edge of a screwdriver from his pocket toolkit and gently worked it loose. Finally, with a soft metallic snap, the lock gave way. The sound seemed unusually loud in the quiet forest. For several seconds, neither man nor dog moved. Then Caleb slowly lifted the lid. A faint scent escaped immediately. Not decay, not mildew, something older. The smell of aged paper and cedar wood preserved beneath years of darkness. Inside lay several carefully wrapped bundles protected by faded cloth. Whoever buried the box had taken extraordinary care. Caleb unfolded the first layer. Beneath it rested a black and white photograph. He lifted it carefully. Despite its age, the image remained surprisingly clear. Two young men stood beside a small pine sapling. Both were smiling. One held a shovel. The other carried a bucket of water. Behind them stretched the same Montana valley Caleb knew today. His eyes drifted toward the uprooted giant lying nearby. A chill moved through him. The sapling in the photograph appeared to be the very tree that had just fallen. He turned the photograph over. A handwritten date covered the back. June 14th, 2001. More than 20 years earlier. Beneath the date was a short inscription. For the promise we will never break. Caleb stared at the words. The handwriting belonged to someone he did not recognize. Yet the message carried a strange weight. A promise. Between whom? And why bury it beneath the tree? Ranger leaned forward and sniffed the photograph. His ears lifted slightly. Caleb reached into the box again. Beneath the photograph rested a stack of letters bound together with a faded blue ribbon. The paper had yellowed with age, but the envelopes remained sealed. Every one of them carried the same name written carefully across the front. Emily Harper. Caleb counted them. 1, 2, 5, 8, 12 letters in total. None appeared opened. None appeared mailed. The final envelope sat at the bottom of the bundle. Unlike the others, it carried additional writing beneath the name. If this is ever found, please make sure she knows the truth. The last rays of sunlight slipped through the trees and illuminated the faded ink. Caleb felt his heartbeat quicken. Whatever had been hidden beneath the roots was not treasure, not money, not forgotten property. It was a story someone had buried more than 2 decades earlier and somehow hoped would one day be discovered. Beside him, Ranger stared quietly at the letters. And deep within the growing shadows of the forest, the mystery was only beginning. The temperature dropped sharply after sunset. By the time Caleb and Ranger returned to the cabin, a thin layer of frost had already begun forming across the wooden porch. The metal box sat on the kitchen table beneath a warm pool of light cast by an old hanging lamp. Outside, the Montana wilderness disappeared into darkness. Inside, the scent of cedar, coffee, and aged paper filled the quiet room. Ranger lay beside the fireplace, but unlike most evenings, he remained awake. His amber eyes followed every movement Caleb made. The retired Marine carefully arranged the contents of the box across the table. The photograph rested near the center. The bundle of letters sat beside it. For several minutes, he simply stared at them. It felt wrong to open mail that had never belonged to him. Yet the final message on the envelope echoed through his thoughts. Please make sure she knows the truth. Whoever wrote those words had expected someone to find them one day. Slowly, Caleb selected the oldest letter from the stack. The envelope carried a date from the summer of 2001. The seal had weakened with age and opened easily. Inside was a neatly folded page written in blue ink. The handwriting matched the inscription on the photograph. Caleb began reading. The letter was addressed to Emily Harper. The writer introduced himself as Noah Bennett. His words carried warmth, optimism, and the simple excitement of a young man planning a future. He described planting a pine tree together with his closest friend and spoke about promises, dreams, and returning home after traveling for work. There was nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just ordinary hopes from someone who clearly cared deeply about the woman receiving the letter. Caleb opened another, then another. Weeks turned into months through the pages. Noah continued writing. He shared stories from different towns, small adventures, quiet reflections, memories he wanted Emily to know. Yet something strange quickly became apparent. None of the letters mentioned receiving a reply. Every page felt like part of a conversation happening in only one direction. Caleb frowned. Why keep writing if no answers ever came back? Ranger lifted his head slightly as Caleb reached for one of the later envelopes. The tone changed immediately. Noah sounded worried, uncertain. One passage stopped Caleb cold. I do not know why my letters keep coming back, but I will not stop trying. He read the sentence again, then another below it. If someone is keeping us apart, I promise I will find a way back to you. The room suddenly felt colder. Caleb continued reading. Several letters later, Noah mentioned a growing conflict involving property records and disagreements within his family. He never explained every detail, but his concern was obvious. Then came the final letter, the last one ever written. The paper felt more worn than the others. Noah's handwriting appeared less steady, yet his message remained clear. If anything happens and these words are never delivered, know that I never abandoned you. I never stopped coming home. Caleb slowly lowered the page. Silence settled across the cabin. Wind brushed softly against the windows. The fire crackled behind him. Ranger stood and walked to the table. The German shepherd rested his nose near the photograph. Caleb looked down at the image again. two young men beside a newly planted tree. One of them was Noah Bennett. The other remained unidentified. Then Caleb noticed something he had missed earlier. A name stitched onto the second man's work jacket. The letters were faint, but visible beneath the lamp. Daniel Harper. Caleb's heartbeat quickened. Harper. The same last name as Emily. Suddenly, the mystery expanded beyond a missing letter, beyond a buried box, beyond a fallen tree. Somewhere inside these pages was a reason why 20 years of messages had never reached the person they were written for. And for the first time, Caleb began to suspect that the answer involved someone much closer to Emily than Noah ever realized. Sleep did not come easily that night. Long after midnight, Caleb remained seated at the kitchen table while the letters lay spread before him beneath the warm glow of the lamp. Outside, the forest rested beneath a blanket of frost. Inside, the mystery continued growing larger with every piece of evidence. Ranger slept beside the fireplace for a few hours, but sometime before dawn, he quietly rose and returned to the table. The German shepherd rested his head near the photograph as though guarding it. Caleb poured another cup of coffee and examined the image again. Noah Bennett. Daniel Harper. A newly planted pine tree. June 2001. The same tree that had hidden the box for more than 20 years. By sunrise, he had made a decision. The answers were not in the cabin. They were somewhere in the town records. 2 hours later, Caleb and Ranger arrived at the small historical society building in the nearby community. The structure sat beside an old church and had served as the town archive for decades. Inside, shelves overflowed with newspapers, photographs, and local records dating back generations. Margaret Ellis, the elderly volunteer who managed the archive, greeted Caleb warmly. She had known nearly everyone in the valley at one time or another. When Caleb showed her the photograph, her expression changed immediately. "I know those boys," she said softly. She adjusted her glasses and studied the image more carefully. "That is Noah Bennett on the left, Daniel Harper on the right." Caleb leaned forward. "What happened to them?" Margaret hesitated. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but it felt significant. "That depends on who you ask." She disappeared into a back room and returned carrying several folders. Dust drifted through the sunlight, filtering across the old wooden floor. Ranger sat quietly beside Caleb while Margaret opened one of the files. Newspaper clippings appeared first. Community photographs followed. The story gradually emerged. Noah Bennett had been widely respected. Honest. Hardworking. Known throughout the valley for helping neighbors whenever they needed assistance. Daniel Harper had been equally well-liked. The two men had been close friends for years. Then everything changed during the summer of 2002. Margaret slid a yellowed newspaper across the table. The headline immediately captured Caleb's attention. "Local man leaves town without notice." The article described Noah's sudden disappearance. According to the report, he left behind his home, his belongings, and several unfinished projects. No explanation had ever been publicly given. Caleb frowned. Did anyone know why? Margaret slowly shook her head. Not officially. She opened another folder. Inside rested a series of handwritten notes collected during local interviews many years earlier. One name appeared repeatedly. Daniel Harper. Neighbors reported that after Noah vanished, Daniel discouraged people from asking questions. He claimed Noah wanted privacy and preferred to start a new life elsewhere. Over time, the town accepted the explanation. The story faded into memory. Yet one detail stood out immediately. Daniel became the primary source for nearly every account of Noah's disappearance. Caleb felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The letters told a different story. Noah had never intended to disappear. He had been trying desperately to return. He had been writing to Emily, waiting for answers that never came. Margaret pointed toward one final document. A property record. The address listed belonged to the Harper family farm. Caleb stared at it. Emily Harper. Daniel Harper. The same last name. The same family. Suddenly a possibility emerged that he had not considered before. What if the person standing between Noah and Emily had not been a stranger at all? What if it had been someone inside her own family? Ranger lifted his head and looked toward Caleb. The old dog remained silent, but his steady gaze seemed to confirm what Caleb already felt. Somewhere beyond the faded records and forgotten headlines lay a truth that had been hidden almost as carefully as the box beneath the fallen tree. The drive back from town felt longer than usual. Snow drifted across the highway in thin ribbons, while gray clouds rolled low over the mountains. Caleb kept replaying the evidence in his mind. Noah Bennett had never planned to disappear. The letters proved that much. Yet for more than 20 years, nearly everyone in the valley had believed he simply walked away. Somewhere between the truth and the story people accepted, something had gone terribly wrong. Ranger sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the landscape pass beyond the window. The German shepherd seemed calmer now, as though each new discovery brought them closer to the answer he had somehow sensed beneath the fallen tree. Late that afternoon, Caleb parked outside the old Harper family farm. The property sat several miles from town, surrounded by open fields and weathered fences. Time had left its mark on the place. Paint peeled from the barn. The farmhouse porch sagged slightly beneath years of harsh winters. Yet the property remained occupied. Smoke drifted from a chimney. A truck sat parked beside the house. Caleb hesitated for a moment before approaching the front door. He was not entirely sure what he hoped to find. The door opened after a few seconds. An elderly woman stood inside. Her silver hair framed a face marked by both kindness and age. Caleb introduced himself and explained that he had been researching local history connected to Noah Bennett and Daniel Harper. The woman's expression changed instantly. Surprise gave way to sadness. Then recognition. "You should come inside," she said quietly. Her name was Martha Harper, Daniel's younger sister. The living room felt frozen in time. Family photographs covered the walls. Old furniture stood exactly where it might have stood 20 years earlier. Ranger settled beside the fireplace, while Caleb carefully explained how he had discovered the metal box beneath the uprooted pine tree. He showed Martha the photograph, then the letters. By the time she saw Noah's handwriting, tears had already formed in her eyes. She touched one envelope gently. "I have not seen this name in years," she whispered. Silence settled across the room. Finally, Martha looked toward a framed photograph resting on a shelf. It showed a young woman standing beside Daniel. Emily Harper. Caleb followed her gaze. Was Emily his daughter? Martha nodded slowly. His only child. The answer immediately connected several pieces of the puzzle. Martha took a deep breath and stared toward the window. Snow drifted outside beneath the fading afternoon light. Daniel loved Emily more than anything, she said. But he could also be stubborn. Too stubborn. She explained that Emily and Noah had fallen deeply in love during their early 20s. They planned to marry. Most people expected it to happen. Everyone except Daniel. For reasons Martha never fully understood, Daniel disapproved of the relationship. He believed Noah's plans to travel for work would lead Emily away from the valley. Arguments followed. Then more arguments. The tension grew worse with time. Caleb listened carefully. Every word brought them closer to the truth. Martha reached for one of the unopened letters. Her hands trembled slightly. "There was one summer when Noah kept writing," she said softly. "Emily waited every day for those letters." Caleb felt his heartbeat quicken. Martha closed her eyes briefly. But somehow they never arrived. The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed quieter. Ranger lifted his head. Martha opened her eyes and looked directly at Caleb. "Years later, after Emily moved away, I discovered something hidden in Daniel's workshop." She paused. The weight of the memory was visible on her face. A box filled with returned letters. Noah's letters. Caleb froze. The realization hit him immediately. The letters had never been lost. They had never failed to arrive. Someone had intercepted them. Someone who believed they were protecting their daughter. And suddenly, the promise buried beneath the roots of a tree no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like the final piece of a heartbreak that had lasted more than 2 decades. The fire burned low in the Harper farmhouse as evening settled across the valley. Shadows danced along the walls while snow drifted silently beyond the windows. Caleb sat quietly across from Martha Harper, absorbing the weight of everything she had revealed. Ranger remained near the fireplace, his amber eyes moving between them as though listening to every word. Martha folded her hands in her lap and stared at the unopened letters spread across the coffee table. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Some truths required silence before they could be understood. Finally, Martha reached for one of the envelopes and held it carefully. "Emily never knew," she said softly. "Not once." Caleb looked at the stack of letters. 12 messages. 12 chances for 2 people to stay connected. 12 chances that never arrived. Martha explained that Daniel had intercepted the letters as they came. At first, he convinced himself he was protecting his daughter. Noah traveled frequently for work and often spoke of opportunities beyond Montana. Daniel feared Emily would leave forever. The more serious the relationship became, the more determined he grew to stop it. Yet according to Martha, Daniel never expected the consequences that followed. When Emily stopped hearing from Noah, she believed he had changed his mind. When Noah stopped receiving responses, he believed Emily no longer wanted him in her life. Both suffered the same heartbreak. Neither knew why. Years passed. Misunderstandings hardened into acceptance. Eventually, each moved forward carrying unanswered questions. Caleb felt a deep sadness settle over him. So much pain had grown from a secret that never should have existed. Martha stood and crossed the room. She opened a drawer inside an old wooden cabinet and removed a small framed photograph. The image showed a young Emily and Noah standing together beside the same pine tree shortly after it had been planted. Their smiles were effortless, genuine, hopeful. Martha handed the photograph to Caleb. On the back, someone had written a short sentence. "We will meet here again when everything is settled." Caleb stared at the words. The promise suddenly made sense. The tree had not simply marked a place. It had marked a future they expected to share. A future that never arrived. Martha sat down again and looked toward the darkening window. "A few years before Daniel died, he confessed everything to me." Her voice trembled slightly. "He regretted it every day." Caleb listened carefully. According to Martha, Daniel had planned to tell Emily the truth many times. He even gathered the letters together on several occasions. Yet shame always stopped him. The longer he waited, the harder the confession became. Eventually, he hid the letters inside the metal box beneath the growing pine tree, a place connected to both Noah and Emily, a place he believed nobody would ever discover. Caleb slowly exhaled. The irony felt almost impossible. The secret had remained hidden beneath the roots of a promise, while the tree continued growing above it year after year. Then one storm changed everything. Martha looked toward Ranger. A faint smile touched her face. "Funny, is it not?" she said quietly. "After all these years, a dog found what none of us could." Caleb glanced down at the German shepherd. Ranger rested peacefully beside the fire, unaware of the praise being directed toward him. Yet without him, the truth might have remained buried forever. Before leaving, Caleb asked the question that had been growing in his mind all evening. "Where is Emily now?" Martha's eyes softened immediately. She walked to a bookshelf and retrieved a small notebook. Inside was a carefully preserved address written several years earlier. She handed it to Caleb. "She lives in Idaho now." Caleb looked down at the page. The answer he needed sat only inches from his hand. Outside, snow continued falling beneath the night sky. Inside, the final path of the journey had just revealed itself. Somewhere beyond the mountains, a woman had spent more than 20 years believing she had been forgotten. And at last, the truth was on its way to find her. 3 days later, Caleb and Ranger were traveling west beneath a pale winter sky. The mountains gradually gave way to rolling hills as they crossed into Idaho. Snow remained scattered across open fields, but the roads were clear. The letters rested inside a leather satchel on the passenger seat beside Caleb. Every mile seemed to carry a little more weight. For more than 20 years, those envelopes had remained unopened. 20 years of words waiting for the person they were meant to reach. Ranger slept quietly for part of the drive, his head resting near the satchel. Occasionally, he lifted his eyes toward Caleb before settling back down again. By early afternoon, they reached a small town nestled between wooded hills and farmland. The address Martha provided led them to a modest white house surrounded by bare maple trees. Smoke rose gently from the chimney. A bird feeder hung near the porch. The place felt peaceful, lived in, loved. Caleb parked along the curb and sat quietly for a moment. Suddenly, he felt nervous. He had spent days uncovering the truth, yet delivering it felt far more difficult. Ranger stepped out first and stretched beneath the cold sunlight. Together, they walked toward the front door. Caleb knocked softly. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened. A woman in her late 50s stood before them. Silver touched her brown hair. Her eyes carried both warmth and quiet sadness. Years had softened her features, but Caleb immediately recognized her from the old photographs. Emily Harper. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then Emily noticed Ranger. A gentle smile appeared. "Well, hello there." The German shepherd wagged his tail once and sat politely beside Caleb. Something about the simple gesture eased the tension. Caleb introduced himself and explained that he had come from Montana regarding a matter connected to Noah Bennett. The smile vanished from Emily's face. Her eyes widened slightly. For several seconds, she seemed unable to speak. Finally, she stepped aside. "Please come in." The living room was warm and filled with afternoon sunlight. Family photographs rested on shelves. Books lined the walls. Caleb noticed several framed landscapes of Montana hanging near the fireplace. Even after all these years, part of her heart had clearly remained there. They sat together at a small dining table while Ranger rested nearby. Caleb carefully removed the photograph from the satchel and placed it before her. The moment Emily saw Noah's face, tears immediately filled her eyes. She reached for the image with trembling fingers. "I have not seen this picture in 20 years, she whispered. Silence settled over the room. Caleb explained everything. The storm, the fallen tree, the hidden box, the letters. He told the story slowly and gently, allowing each piece to find its place. Emily listened without interruption. Several times, she wiped tears from her cheeks. When Caleb finally placed the bundle of unopened letters before her, she simply stared at them. 12 envelopes. 12 lost years preserved in paper and ink. Carefully, she picked up the first letter, then the second, then the last. Her fingers traced Noah's handwriting as though reconnecting with someone she had never truly stopped loving. The room remained quiet except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. After several minutes, Emily opened the final envelope. She read Noah's words silently. Halfway through the page, she covered her mouth and began crying softly. Not from fresh heartbreak, not from anger, but from relief. The kind of relief that arrives when a question carried for decades finally receives an answer. Ranger slowly crossed the room and rested beside her chair. Without thinking, Emily lowered one hand onto the old German shepherd's head. He remained perfectly still. Outside, sunlight glowed across the snow-covered yard. Inside, 20 years of misunderstanding were beginning to fade. And for the first time since opening the door, Emily smiled through her tears as though a part of her life had finally come home. The next morning arrived quietly. Fresh snow covered the streets outside Emily's home, while pale sunlight filtered through the kitchen window. Caleb stood on the porch preparing for the long drive back to Montana. Ranger sat beside him, calm and content, watching the peaceful neighborhood awaken beneath the winter sky. Before they left, Emily stepped outside carrying a small wooden frame. Inside was the photograph of Noah and Daniel standing beside the young pine tree more than 20 years earlier. She held it carefully, as though it had become something precious all over again. "For years I thought he forgot me," she said softly. "Yesterday was the first time I learned he never did." Caleb nodded. Sometimes there were no words large enough for a moment like that. Emily smiled through eyes still touched by emotion. "Thank you for bringing him home." Caleb glanced toward the letters resting safely inside her house. They had finally reached their destination. Every page, every hope, every promise. Ranger walked forward and gently pressed his head against Emily's hand. She laughed softly and scratched behind his ears. "And thank you too," she whispered. The old German shepherd closed his eyes for a moment, enjoying the attention. A few minutes later, Caleb and Ranger began the drive east. The mountains gradually returned to the horizon as mile after mile slipped beneath the tires. The journey felt different now, lighter. Somewhere along the way, the mystery had transformed into something else. Not a story about secrets, not a story about betrayal, a story about truth finally finding its way home. 2 days later, they arrived back at the cabin. The fallen pine still rested where the storm had dropped it. Snow covered much of the exposed roots. Caleb walked slowly toward the clearing with Ranger beside him. The place felt strangely peaceful now. He stood for several minutes looking at the massive trunk stretching across the forest floor. More than 20 years earlier, 2 young men had planted that tree together. One had buried a promise beneath it. Another had hidden a painful mistake there. Time had covered both. Yet somehow the truth had survived. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and removed a small envelope Emily had given him before he left. Inside was a single note written the night after she finished reading Noah's letters. He unfolded it carefully. "Thank you for giving me my answer. I can finally let go of the question I carried all these years." Caleb smiled and folded the paper again. Ranger settled beside the exposed roots and gazed across the valley. Golden evening light spread through the trees as the sun slowly descended toward the mountains. The old German shepherd looked peaceful, fulfilled, as though a task he never fully understood had finally been completed. Caleb lowered himself onto a fallen section of trunk and rested one hand on Ranger's shoulder. Together they watched the sunset paint the snow with shades of gold and amber. The wind moved gently through the forest. No secrets remained beneath the roots. No letters waited in darkness. Only silence, honest and clean. Somewhere beyond the mountains, a woman had finally found peace. Somewhere in memory, a promise had finally been delivered. And beside a fallen tree that had guarded the truth for more than 20 years, a loyal German shepherd closed his eyes and rested, knowing that some journeys do not end in victory. They end in grace.